Got it. And now, welcome everyone to the Irish American Heritage Museum. We're having a slightly awful time trying to get the technology working, but we're live streaming onto Facebook because we cannot access our YouTube channel at the moment. We changed laptops and it's not recognizing me. But anyway, we're delighted to have with us tonight Rowan Gillespie. This is our final entry in our Black 47 commemoration series. This year is the 175th anniversary of what was technically the worst year of the Great Hunger in terms of death and immigration and evictions, even though actually the potato harvest that year was not bad. It's just that people didn't have potatoes to sow from the previous 2 years. So there, even though there was no blight, there was also no harvest. Rowan was born in Dublin, but his family immigrated to Cyprus. He's going to tell us a little bit more about that in a minute. But we really wanted to speak to him because he is a unique sculptor. He works completely on his own. He has a one-man foundry, and he personally carries out every aspect of the work from conception to installation. Norma Smurfit and the Smurfit family in Ireland commissioned one of his works, Famine, which was presented to the city of Dublin. And Ireland has struggled with how to commemorate the famine, or even to kind of remember it. You know, we talked about this in the series, that a lot of the workhouses were knocked or they were repurposed. And so it really was not until 1998 that first commemoration anywhere was appeared, which was actually in Boston. And it talked about the duality of the experience, the reality of famine at home in Ireland, and the potential for prosperity by these immigrants over here when they came to America. So Ireland now has Rowan's fantastic piece down on the Keys, and he also has been commissioned by Toronto, where his piece is in Ireland Park, and Hunter Ireland in Tasmania. So Rowan, I'll turn it over to you now, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Well, you've kind of already mentioned that I'm fully 100% Irish, born in Dublin, to Irish parents, and the family emigrated when I was just 3 months old. So I kind of had very little recollection of life in Ireland. It went straight on to Cyprus. And I'm going to start, I thought the best way to do this was to actually to tell you a little bit about my life, how I came to have such an interest in Irish history, how the whole thing started for me. Living in Cyprus was really similar to what was going on in Ireland some 30 years earlier. The Greeks and the Turks were totally united in trying to do one thing, to get independence, to get the British out. So it was a very fraught time, and I often thought to myself that maybe when I was at school later on, I was at school in England and later on at art college in Norway, I often thought that maybe I was sort of exaggerating when I talked about what happened in Cyprus at that time. But in fact, a letter which appeared from my mother, I think it was just 3 years ago we came across this letter. It shows very clearly that I wasn't exaggerating. It was a very difficult time. As it says there, sorry, I'm bouncing on. Three of my parents' friends were shot within a fortnight just before Christmas, one of them being my own godfather. So I kind of naturally, I was pretty scared, worried at night, couldn't sleep. And I spoke to my mother and sort of spoke about it. And she was the one who said, no, don't worry, we are not in danger at all. We're Irish. They respect the Irish. They respect the Irish as being the first group of people to successfully gain independence from the British. So when it came to the day when the Union Jack was lowered over Government House in Nicosia, and the beautiful Cypriot flag was raised. We were there. We were there cheering, excited about the new free state that we were part of. It was a kind of very euphoric time for a while. You could say basically what happened was the British left, the Greeks and the Turks stayed, and the Americans came in. The Americans came in for the mining. Cyprus is called the island of copper, very rich in copper and asbestos. And my father started working. We stayed on when the British left. He started working for the Cyprus Mines Corporation as a doctor. The hospital was down near the sea, near the jetty where the ships went out taking the ore to America. And these trains would trundle down from the mountains, so heavily loaded with the copper ore that chunks of it would kind of fall off as the ship made its way down down from the mountains. And there were workmen from the local little workshop down in Pendaya where we lived. There were workmen who went out and they would pick up the bits of the chunks of ore and put them into a crucible. In that crucible, they would heat it and heat it and heat it until gradually a beautiful golden copper liquid would ooze out of it. They would then pour it into these asbestos molds, not making anything special, just sort of purifying it and then selling it on to craftsmen, mainly Turkish craftsmen, who would make something more worthwhile out of it. But I just loved hanging around in that workshop. I loved being there. I loved the fumes. I loved the smell. I loved the heat. I loved the noises, the whole thing about it. I would be given simple jobs like straightening nails, but I was forever hanging out there and had already at that stage a sort of almost natural feel for the melting of metal. Just like I was a good swimmer from Cyprus, I had a natural feel for metal too. Now, the peace didn't last long. There's a huge parallel to what had happened 30 years earlier in Ireland. There was basically the risk of a civil war breaking out, and it actually never happened as such because, quite simply, the Turks invaded, took over more than half the island, and very much like Ireland, the whole place got split up, divided. It was a good thing that we got out before that, because in fact our house finished up in the buffer zone, so we would have lost everything if we hadn't got out. So before that happened, our old car was loaded onto a ship called the Brunero, which used to ply the seas between Cyprus and Venice. From there, we were going to drive up to York in England, where my father now had a new job as a doctor. The morning after we left, I can remember the ship making those sort of churning noises and shuddering feels that ships make when they're sort of about to drop anchor in a port, and rushing up on deck with my sister to see what we were, where we'd arrived at. And I will never forget what I saw in front of me, Venice. It was something totally new. I had seen beauty in Cyprus, but it was sort of natural beauty. I had never seen anything like this, a whole environment created by man, a beautiful environment created by man. I, as a child, loved the frescoes and the sculptures I saw then. What I would never have known was that actually everything that I was going to do in my life was actually already formed at this stage. The natural affinity to metal, and in Venice seeing what one could do with metal, how one could turn it into bronze sculpture. Within 6 years of this day, I poured my first bronze sculpture in York. Within 13 years, I'd set up my own bronze casting facility in Dublin. This is the place where I still work to this day, pouring bronze or doing whatever I want to do, but that's my workshop space. Now, the initial sculptures were, well, they were always looking and trying to understand something else in life. I think there's actually a trail of sculptures, more or less, going from Venice up towards the north of England. It seems that I was a bit like sort of a dog wanting to piss on every lamppost on the way up, on the journey I'd been on, because down in Treviso, just outside Venice, is the first sculpture in a series called A Woman. It's the idea that a woman looks up and dares to dream of something more, a better future. She then scales the wall of adversity in order to attempt to reach the summit. When she reaches the top, she crouches like a fledgling bird and waits and watches until she reaches out and breaks the constraints that surround her before she takes a mighty leap of faith. You can see we're right up in the Alps here, high up in the Alps, in a place called Liechtenstein, one of the smallest countries in the world. Takes a mighty leap of faith to find that she is free, that she can fly. Now, that would be the kind of work I did until, along the same sort of vein, I did a sort of critical sculpture, which is called Enigma. Now, it was that my sister, Lorraine, she somehow never adjusted to the whole thing. She was a happy child when we came up from Cyprus, but somehow things went downhill seriously when we arrived in York. She just didn't adjust to life there. Things went downhill. She became anorexic. She became bulimic. And at the age of 23, she took her life. I was 21. That was tough. That was tough. But within 18 years, I became aware that my own daughter was slipping down the same path, the awful eating disorder of anorexia. I don't know if this sculpture is really a sculpture of my sister or my daughter. I like to think it's my daughter, and I like to think it's the moment that she found the strength to beat it and to carry on and to become the wonderful person that she is today. But the thing is, from that, I knew certain things. I knew the hollow look of starvation. I knew that blankness in the eyes. I knew from my sister what a person looked like when they were emaciated from lack of food. I also knew what it felt like for a father fearing for the very life of his own daughter, carrying a limp body up to her bed and hoping she'd be all right. So many things came together in 1 year when I made probably the most important sculpture in my lifetime, Famine, in Dublin. I had the emotion to put into it. I'd seen things, but because I had been educated in Cyprus and England, I, like most people there, even though we had an Irish history teacher, I hardly knew anything about the Great Famine. So when I started working on this piece, it was like a complete voyage of discovery for me. I was reading, I was immersed in it through every stage of the making of it. Firstly filled with anger, but then moving back and just saying, this is how the people might have looked. But quite a few sort of different things happened in it. The spacing of the sculptures, the choosing not to put them on pedestals so that the viewer has to walk amongst the figures, not look at them as an outsider. The use of family history. My great-grandfather emigrated to Toronto, so he became sort of one of the figures in the series. But most importantly, the unusual use of bronze, that sort of craggy, worn look, where it's hardly recognizable as bronze, the sort of rusty color, the color of famine. I developed for it because I work totally alone, and certainly on the scale I work on, I'd be absolutely unique in the world. I sort of developed a way of working wax, not clay, but going directly to wax in a sort of semi-molten state. So it was sort of globby and hard to push together, pushing it into the shapes I needed. And then once I'd got it basically there, running over it with a blowtorch in order to sort of just melt and fuse the pieces together. Then once the shape I wanted was made, I'd cut it all up, cut it into pieces, and stack them inside a very strict framework. Once they're stacked, shuttering went into the framework, and the whole lot, the whole shuttered off piece got filled with plaster. So the wax sculpture is now embedded in that block of plaster. Once the plaster goes hard, it goes into the kiln for baking. The baking and the burning out of the wax goes on, well, in that case, it was happening for about 3 days to make sure that the mold is completely dry. Any moisture in a mold is incredibly dangerous for bronze casting. And then on the 4th day, early in the morning, starting to melt the bronze. It'll take about 4 hours to melt a pot of bronze. It's infinitely recyclable, so that's sort of old bits of bronze going in there, and there'd be fresh ingots and so on. While the bronze is melting, the kiln comes away from the mold, exposing the big block of plaster with now a cavity where the wax once was. So I suppose it's pretty obvious what I do next. It is to lift the crucible out of the furnace once it's molten. And that just looks so peaceful and easy, but I can assure you the weight of that is probably, in American terms, it's about 400 pounds, and the heat is quite incredible, which is coming from it. Bring it over to the mold and pour the beautiful copper goldy mixture into the mold, the goddess of metals, bronze. It hardens very quickly, but it's very brittle at that stage. So you have to leave it for 4 hours minimum, preferably overnight, before simply smashing the mold off. The mold is not reusable, it's gone. It can be recycled, but not reused. Once the worst is taken off, the casting gets soaked in a big tank of water, so the rest of the plaster sort of washes away and dissolves down into the bottom of the tank. When it comes out, you've got the raw bronze cast. Not the shiny look you might imagine, no, it's an exact replica of that sort of clumpy modeling I was doing with the half molten wax. You don't do a sculpture, full-size figure in one piece. It's several sections which have to get welded together. So you can probably see on the child there, you can see a slightly darker line around the waist there. That would be 2 casts in there, the lower bit, the upper bit. On the bigger man, it would be a join below the trousers there, and another one around the waistband or whatever. So when those get joined together, the whole thing comes together then. It's a matter of crating the sculptures up and driving them on my own to Dublin port. I don't know how many times I've been down to that port with these sort of coffin-like boxes and with them going off to different places around the world. On this occasion, to Toronto. These are the same characters, you might say. They are the arrival of the people on the quays in Dublin, but it's a slightly depleted number now because allowing for the ones who would have died in the coffin ships on the way over. But this is the arrival part of it all. The front figure being the one that I told you earlier was inspired by my great-grandfather who emigrated to Montreal. I sort of saw him as being one of the ones who maybe envisaged the future cities of the New World. In fact, he was one of the ones who built was involved in building the railroads across Canada. And he did indeed do well, married and became a pillar of society in Canada. It's sort of, I suppose, what we in Ireland tend to think, you know, there's a huge awareness in Ireland of the number of people who died in the time of the famine, who died in Ireland, and how many died on the coffin ships on the way over. But then there's this sort of idea that, you know, they kind of went off to the Wild West, a bit like the good, bad, and the ugly. They went across, they sort of trekked across America heading west. This sculpture is up in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, so high up in the Rocky Mountains. That is the image we tend to have over here. But of course, the truth is quite different from that. The truth is that they died like flies. With a 7-year life expectancy on arrival, it changes your statistics fairly dramatically. This is the corner of a parking lot on Staten Island. There's now a courthouse being built in this area, but it was when they were starting to do excavations and so on for it that they discovered the skeletal remains of more than 600 Irish immigrants who were all thrown in a mass grave there. Amazingly, they managed to decipher through a process of elimination, I think, the name, the date of birth, the date of death, the cause of death of every single one of those people in the parking lot. It was a project I got quite involved in, and I mean, you are dealing quite simply with a place of death. And my idea was to engrave every single name, every one of those names, so that one would walk over the names and then just have a single dead body lying on the sea of names. Now, it was a project that never came to fruition. It didn't happen. All that came from it is 2 tables engraved tables, which are in the Great Hunger Museum at, well, used to be at Quinnipiac. It's moving now, but these two tables do have every single name cut into them. So I did feel that it was a very sort of, that I'd done my bit. I understood that sculptures of death are not maybe what people want to have in their city. There's been more demand generally, of course, for the people who met with significant success within their lifetimes, like little Johnny Kilbane here. Now, he actually was born in Cleveland, Ohio. It was his parents who emigrated from Achill Island. But Johnny his mother died in childbirth when he was just 4 years old. And then his father went blind when he was 9 years old. So Johnny started carrying water to the miners in Cleveland at a very young age in order to try to make a little bit of money for the family. He got really teased and beaten up by the other boys for his sort of small frame and skinny little legs. But as a result, he became really quick. He became a great little street fighter. And he was spotted by a scout who thought he could actually maybe become a good boxer. Well, he did. He became world featherweight boxing champion, holding the title for 12 years, longer than anybody else has held a world champion title for. He became very famous, very wealthy, did extremely well at that time, but lost it all in the Great Depression. So he found himself having to reinvent himself yet again. He went into politics, stood for the county council, Cleveland, and got a position there, fighting tirelessly as a councillor for the rights of the Irish living in the ghetto, where he'd spent his whole life. The sculpture stands right beside the railroad track, where he spent his whole lifetime. I depicted him as a champion at all three stages of his life, as a child, as a boxer, and as a councillor. The fists were one way out of the ghetto for the Irish. There were, I suppose, the fists, the police force, but one of the other ones was through the church, the priesthood. This man, John Hughes, was a remarkable man in that he was a gardener in Sligo. I don't even know if he was literate when he went over to Manhattan. He had a gardening job in the grounds of a convent, but had an absolute desire to join the priesthood. It was the Mother Superior there who got him a place in a seminary. And he rose through the ranks of the Catholic Church at a lightning speed, becoming the very first Archbishop of New York. It's when I look at this photograph, I see that it actually shows kind of very clearly the way, the wax of a sculpture, how the whole thing happens. I mean, from the very few photographs available of John Hughes, those two photographs being the same one, just one is a more close up than the other one, and then him as an older man over there. But the way I would do the maquette first, the small version of what I'm going to do, and here it shows quite clearly how, whoops, we're moving on too fast, sorry about that, how the maquette is a sort of replica of the cross that I'm starting to do around the neck. The idea that there's going to be a cross within a cross in the whole thing. So the maquette then is blown up to life size. That is, it looks small there, but that's a life-size John Hughes. This is now double life-size. So it's gradually moving it up in scale. I know that probably looks a lot more than twice life-size to you, but you must remember when you're dealing with volume, twice the size is 8 times the volume. So the bronze casting, the bronze was a big cast. I'd say probably the biggest single piece pour that I ever did. He was a difficult man to work with in one way because he when I looked in at what I had of him, it turned out that he was cross-eyed. So I thought, well, if I do him cross-eyed, people are going to think that I can't sculpt eyes. And then he also wore the most incredibly ill-fitting wig. You can imagine what wigs looked like in about 1860. So I thought, if I do that wig, it's going to look like I can't do hair either. So I think I chose to do him more at the sort of comb-over stage in the process. But anyway, the sculpture got over to Lower Manhattan. It's just outside St. Patrick's Basilica, the old St. Patrick's Cathedral. John Hughes devoted his life to helping the poor in the tenements, particularly the Irish community in the tenements, and the children, so many orphan children at that time. He set up a school for them, a place where they could stay. He was a great believer in education. But what he would have been most known for is that his fight against the nativists for the freedom of different beliefs, different religions to be able to flourish in America. If anybody's seen the movie Gangs of New York, he actually features in that. He was no kind of meek follower of Jesus in that way. He was a tough guy. You wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of him. But with doing this sculpture, like everything else, the research level that I go into is really quite extreme. And sometimes people say to me, well, why do you bother to kind of track down every detail of what he did and what he wore and so on? But actually with this one, it really paid off, because when Cardinal Dolan saw the sculpture, the first thing he noticed was the cross. The cross being twice the size, but exactly the same cross as he has around his own neck. That is the cross that gets handed down from one archbishop to the next in New York. So it was very satisfying to have done it the right way. Now, within these sculptures, and there have been several more that I did of emigrants and what happened to them afterwards, but I started to realize they were all men. And it sort of really came into my mind, what did happen to the women? Well, very near where I live, a beautiful harbour, Dunleary Harbour, kind of holds a very dark, sinister history. Because it was from here that tens of thousands of women got transported as a commodity, transported because they were valuable, transported as the breeding stock of Australia. Not just breeding stock, but hopefully they thought a slightly civilizing influence on the male society there. Now, slavery had been abolished, but the concept was that convicts had no rights at all. So the principle of exporting convicts and making them do whatever servitude, whatever they were chosen to do for the period of their sentence, seemed like a good idea, especially as they'd never be able to get back again afterwards. I found it hard to take on a fairly major commission on the other side of the world and just sort of make them in Ireland and plonk them down in Tasmania, Australia. So the thought was to use descendants of the convicts as my models, sculpting the woman of today as if she was the ancestor. It was a really satisfying process, sort of using my model through to her mother, through to the ancestor, sort of conduit to the past. And they were so helpful in making the whole thing happen. I had researchers who would follow up every one of these girls, like little Emily here, who left Wicklow when she was just 16 years old, went to work for as a servant in a house in London, for it seems quite a nice woman. But then the daughter to the woman came home with her husband in order to give birth to her child. During that time, I don't know if the man raped Emily, but he certainly had his way with her. And when it showed that she was pregnant a few months later, the family claimed that she'd been stealing from them all along. There's no evidence that she was, but all they had to do is claim it, and she got transported to Van Diemen's Land. Like many other women, she gave birth on the crossing. So she arrived in Hobart, infant in arms, as they said. The remarkable thing with this sculpture was that when we tracked down the descendant, Lane, she had just given birth to a little baby boy, Harvey, a week earlier. So all I had to do was sculpt her exactly as she was. The concept I had from Staten Island about the names and the whole thoughts I had there sort of came back to me. There's these kind of bench things are on Staten Island. They're very near where the ferry sort of goes backwards and forwards. And I don't know why I took a photograph of them, and they came back into my mind because people got so caught up in the idea that that the sculpture I made, the first one of Emily, was Emily and her story. But I was trying to say to them, no, she represents a lot of women. She's representing all the women who arrived infant in arms. So I started to engrave onto a pedestal for Emily, engraved the names of other women who arrived infant in arms, and then for the different sculptures, put them together, rather like those benches on Staten Island, these engraved plinths. So they're walking over them rather like stepping stones. The women on arrival on this very spot, Hunter Island, where they came ashore, is underneath this sort of concrete apron. It's right underneath them. They would have been marched from here, normally at the dead of night, to the foothills of the mountain you can see in the distance. They would have been marched up to a place there called the Cascades Female Factory. You could really call it female prison. They'd go in there to await their fate. What they didn't know, many of them would have actually traveled with their children. But what they didn't know when they came ashore was that the children were not going to go with them. Only the children that were being breastfed would go with their mother. The other ones stayed behind, like little Toby here. They're a few hundred children who were left behind by their mothers as a complete surprise on arrival, and the names of the other ones are engraved onto the pedestal for Toby. The children were then taken to the other side of Hobart to a place called the Queen's Orphanage. Now that's obviously a cheat in itself, because they weren't orphans, they had a mother. The mother was sent up to the female factory, and the reason they were separated was quite simply that the women were more useful if they didn't have children in tow. These two, William and Marianne, they were brother and sister. They actually were orphans purely because their mother, on arrival, got beaten to death by a male convict. So they were sent into the orphanage to the age of 16, having watched their mother being beaten to death. The women who'd been sent up to the female factory would be once a week lined up against the wall at the back of the yard, where the local population could come and inspect them. They could go down the line of women, and you must remember it would be mainly a male population. They could go down the line of women and choose whichever one they wanted. The man would take the handkerchief out of his pocket, drop it on the floor, on the ground, and the woman would pick it up, hand it back, and that would be deemed a contract. She would be there for serving him, for doing whatever he desired. She was his slave. If she displeased in any way at all, he could just send her back. She would then be given punishment, solitary confinement, and he could choose somebody else. The project there became quite successful from the point of view that there's always been this thing called the convict stain in Australia, the sort of shame connected to being descendants of convicts. But this rather turned it around, because suddenly the idea of having your daughter immortalized in bronze meant that mothers were saying to their children sort of, well, we never told you this before, darling, but actually we are descendants of convicts. So it came to the stage where, after making 8 of these figures, which are at different places, 4 different locations around the city, it was time to stop. It was time to move on. Then, of course, it's like cutting the umbilical cord. You just sort of leave them, and I probably will never go back. So there's something kind of nice when a few years later I get a photograph like this one sent to me, which shows that actually sculptures can take on a life of their own without me having to push them along all the way. That people can take them and read into them what they want. I think if you make history pop out of the pavement, sort of that this actually happened here, this is the place where it happened, it has a right to stand there. There's something very special about having people sort of stop and looking, sometimes not knowing what it is they're looking at. There's sort of bewilderment. But if they're stopping and thinking, surely that's a value in itself. Of course, there's the people who actually want me to meet them and tell them what a sculpture is about. That would be a fairly regular thing, and I happily do that. When I talk about the sculptures, I do not think there's any, I don't place blame, I don't judge with them. All I'm saying with these sculptures is this is how the people might have looked, and they stood here. I do like, though, when the history works its way into today. I do like it when the sculptures become a sort of symbolic moral compass for what is right in the world today. I like that sort of time warp type of thing. Probably most of all, I like the way when working with a girl like Marianne, watching her mother being beaten to death, and then find myself working with the descendant, little Estella, who couldn't stay still for a split second, not long enough for that photograph to be taken, let alone for a sculpture to be made of her, and see that sort of the joy in her as she sort of would run over and hug me and chat and sing, to see how much good can come from such a dark and shameful past. That gives me great satisfaction. Thank you very much. That's it.
Well, Rowan, that was beautiful. I knew I wanted to end the series with, you know, an artist or somebody creative, because sometimes, and you know, of course, I'm a historian, I adore history, and I do think it's the telling of stories, but you have managed to humanize, and our other historians who spoke were brilliant, but like, you've just brought in another dimension to how we talk about the legacy of the famine, the suffering, you know, that was incurred, and that history and art, you know, can be the inspiration for activism. So I have loads of notes. Those of you who are online with us, if you want, you know, can use the Q&A feature down here, or the chat feature. And if you're live on the Facebook page, you know, just put a comment under there, and I'll moderate all of these things if I can find where we are. I'm sure we're up somewhere on Facebook. I just can't see it right now. So yeah, I have loads of, first of all, I want to say thank you for sharing how personal your own story was. I wasn't expecting that. So I'm very sorry on the loss of your sister, and hopefully your daughter, you know, made a recovery. I was struck during your talk about how female centric a lot of your stories are, even a topic like, you know, the Great Hunger, and your first one with the women ascending. So thank you for sharing, you know, your own story, because I know that's must have been kind of painful. And I think that personal link, that was one of my questions before we had, you know, before you gave your talk. I was wondering about your process on dealing with the Great Hunger, because we have been so sort of odd in Ireland, you know, about, you learn about it up to a certain extent kind of thing. And then, you know, I was a child of the 80s and 90s. The Troubles were ongoing. So there's a big movement, correctly, probably among historians at home, to not necessarily ascribe blame, you know, like you have to kind of tell the story, but we run into it a lot in the museum here, for instance, that people keep wanting to call it a genocide, where most Irish historians would argue it is not, you know, semantically, legally, it does not meet the definition of genocide. And of course, there were plenty of Irish people, you know, who survived and thrived during the Great Hunger, who mismanaged things in the workhouse and all that. So like it's not, historians are not in the business of pointing fingers, you know. So I wanted to ask you, I thought that was very moving when you said that you knew yourself as a father, because that piece in Dublin is incredibly powerful. I can't remember if there's even a very big plinth that says, you know, that you're the sculptor and what the piece is called. You kind of just walk upon it sometimes, you know, if you're going down by the IFC or the docks. And so, but you can see the pain etched in those people's faces. So, you know, how much research did you do? I mean, technical research into the Great Hunger and the statistics and all that. And how much was yourself just coming from the emotions of, I have carried my daughter's hungry, bony body. I know what this feels like.
I mean, the research was intensive on the whole thing. But I think you've sort of touched on a lot of different things there. The attitude that we in Ireland have to the famine is so different from the attitude that people who emigrated and made a success of their life in America have. And I think there's many reasons for that. I think I have to say that my father begged me not to make that sculpture. He said I had no right to make the sculpture. And I said to him, but we are a Quaker family, surely, as a Quaker, I have a right to do something. And he said, no, you have no right. We didn't suffer.
Oh,
And he refused to ever look at the sculpture to the day he died.
oh
He
my God.
never looked at a picture of it or anything.
Wow.
And that touches in on the shame which
Yeah.
goes in Ireland with the
survivor kind of.
Yes. You don't know what, when you've got a village of 30 people and only one family remained and survived, what did they do in order to survive?
Yeah.
And the possible shame for what they did, does that get handed on from generation to generation? I think it does.
Yeah.
I think that it's a very complex thing. And when you start to deal, when I started working on the research, yes, I did start to go down the genocide route and the anger route, but it was my brother who pulled me up and said, no, it wasn't at all, and made me back off. And I'm so glad I did, because as soon as you do a thing like that, people could point at it and say, it's not accurate, that's not right. But when you just sort of remove yourself from it and show people as they might have been, nobody can criticize. Nobody can say, well, that's not how it was.
Yeah.
When that picture of Harry and Meghan Markle there, the heckling from the other side of the river, it was like a private time I had with them. And there was all of this shouting from the other side that they had no right to be there.
Well, because
everybody has a right
had, everyone does, of course, yeah.
So,
I mean, I just, your whole presentation, I'm looking at my notes. I thought it was, you said, you know, your own great grandfather had been the inspiration, and he was the one, if I'm right, that has the child draped. And then when he's in Canada, his hands are uplifted. So I was thinking, you know, I was struck by is this a positive, you know, thing, like, look at how much potential is here, or like, are his hands empty because his child died? Maybe it's both. And that's true of all immigration stories. I suppose there is a push and a pull. Obviously the famine is, you know, particularly tragic, but there is a push and a pull element in every immigrant's life, which, you know, you have felt yourself and your family felt, that, you know, sometimes you're sad for what you left, but sometimes you're excited for what's ahead of you, you know. So I thought there's just so much symbolism in there. We had your piece on loan to us from the Great Hunger Museum in Quinnipiac, and hopefully we will have it again when the Fairfield thing gets sorted out. That piece is very moving with the names. Like, so many people visited our museum, and, you know, there's Harrington, there's Mulvihill, you know, their own name was there, and, you know, so I thought that was beautiful. Are most of your figures, you know, based on human models, or because when you were talking about the head for I think it was Dagger John Hughes, do you use a human model, or do you just know, like, the artistic, also the mathematical, like the sense of proportion, you know, to a human? Or do you always have someone that you can base it off of?
More and more, I would try to find somebody who looks like the person I'm kind of like now. There's a commission I have going for Ellen Cashman. You've heard about her, have you? Yeah. So that's something I'm doing for Canada again. And I notice I'm going around looking for people who look like her. It sort of becomes an obsession to see if you can find, because obviously it's great help if you find somebody who looks like the person you.
Yeah.
But with John Hughes, I don't think I had anybody. I just went for it without that. With the Johnny Kilbane, I did work from descendants. So that's the first time I worked through descendants, and sort of found him that way. So that tends to be the way. A descendant is always the best.
Yeah, well, and that's, you know, how transformative it must have been for the people in Tasmania to, you know, pose as their own great grandmother, and to hear their stories, which, you know, to be honest, I presume some of those stories were kind of lost to the family. Even, you know, they might be in an archive where you might be able to put it together from records, but they may not have known the full story themselves, you know, 3 generations or 4 generations later. And so, like, were you telling them sometimes, you know,
Yes,
than they knew.
yes, it was. It was a remarkable thing because they wouldn't know anything, and then there were a team of people who were researching each and every one of them. So they got told the story as we went along.
Yeah.
And they got so involved in it. You know, they really loved it.
Yeah.
But all projects like that, you have to draw a line under at a certain stage. Otherwise, you could make one too many and it would all go wrong.
Yeah, well, actually, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of that you did, like, was it 4 women or, you know, in a row there on the stepping stones? And that's right, you could probably do 600, you know, but
it was, they were kind of talking about having a line of them all the way up to the mountain there. You know? But
which at one point it doesn't, it's too much, you know, kind of,
And I'm a one-man operation, so there's only so much I can do.
Yeah. Well, and with the, you know, as you say, the dichotomy between, like, I am sculpting Ellen, this was her specific story, and yet she has to represent, you know, 500 other women or however many. That was incredible. Do you know, Rowan, like, I mean, we have heard brutal stories, women getting raped on the beaches as they were getting off the boats. You know, I know the Earl Grey scheme during the Great Hunger itself, like at least 15 girls from my hometown were shipped out, including one of them who was a Mulvihill. My mother, you know, was Mulvihill, so you wonder if there was a connection. But these women that you were talking about in Tasmania were being sent out as, you know, they had broken a law, so it was transportation, and yet they're kind of given to these men. So they don't have the protection of marriage, it sounds like. And is it not like, you know, in 5 years' time, your sentence is up? Are they there for life, you know, as chattel kind of?
It was a very sort of complex way, because they could get a ticket to leave if they went into servitude with somebody. They would be sort of semi-free, but they would become free. They would become free with time.
Okay.
And it's very important to separate it completely from the sort of coffin ship idea of people going across to America, because a lot of women committed the crime in order to be transported. Yeah. Because the opportunity for life was better than it was. Yeah. During those awful years here, they had more chance over there. Survival, yeah. They would, but I mean, the sentence they had to do and the brutality that they came to in the Cascades female factory was quite incredible. Yeah. And to take their children from them, you know, I said what you've done really with that piece, and even in having the descendants pose, like, you know, that it's the resilience of the women which is being celebrated, as opposed to the stain or shame of their supposed crime, and the fact that they were, you know, penal colony, or, you know, that's I think a beautiful thing that has come out of having the statues. Like, you're not emphasizing the criminality of it, you're emphasizing the humanness of the story, you know. Yeah, I think so. I mean, that isn't to say that within the research I did, there were the women who did pretty awful things. Oh yeah. So, you know, you're not all perfect, but there in general there was a sort of goodness, and they proved to be very good mothers. Mm-hmm. You know, and that tells you quite a lot about them. Yeah. And really the crimes they committed. I mean, is it a crime to steal a loaf of bread when your children are hungry? Yeah, or bleed a cow. Mm-hmm. And then, as you said, to be set up for a crime. The big difference is that there's no such thing as any of them achieving huge success within a lifetime. Yeah. All they managed to do there was get by. You know, they if they married, they could become free, but they would be marrying a male convict who had got free. So, you know, like a bit of oyster farming or something like that was the best they could achieve. Mm-hmm. So you don't have the Archbishop John Hughes type stories there. Yeah. But there's something very beautiful about making sculptures of people who would have never dreamt that they would be a piece of art. Yeah. John Hughes would expect there to be a sculpture out there, but those women would not.
Yeah, and that's, you know, the kind of the democratization of the experience too, you know. Yeah, I think that's beautiful. Are you still doing the Toronto piece? Was beautiful too. I meant to ask you about that. Was that like the famine sheds or the fever sheds as they call them, or Irish sheds, I think they were called? You know, it still is a place where they disembark and try to move on or die where they land.
Sorry, in where?
Was it in Toronto that you got that?
In Toronto, yes. I mean, there were the fever sheds, of course. They went into gross eel first, and I've never been there, in fact. But I mean, I always think though Staten Island is rather similar. I mean,
500 bodies,
really wonder.
And aren't they putting a car park over it or a golf course or something? It was.
It was
kind of found by accident, I think. Yeah.
I don't know what's happened there now, but I do. Whenever I'm over there, I love taking that little ferry across to Staten Island. So I always go and have a look, and it always looks just the same. I mean, they haven't sort of done anything
on
that corner yet. No.
Yeah, it was a big, you know, to do kind of back in the day. I think there had been a car park, and they tore that down, and they, you know, by accident found the mass grave. And then, you know, as far as I know, the Hibernians are involved, but it's supposed to become, I think, a golf club, but who knows, you know, I mean, all those remains there. But it's great that you have found the names. Again, like to just humanize the story. It's one thing to say, you know, there's a mass grave, but to know the names of them, you know, is it?
Well, it's where I learned a lot, because when I got all the names, in the middle of them, there was the name Sarah Gillespie, and 4 years old. And it so happened that my granddaughter was 4 years old at the time. Not called Sarah, but there were Sarahs in the family, sort of, there have been. So, and that's when I realized the incredible power of seeing your own family name there.
Yeah.
You suddenly say, oh, whoa. It just comes that much closer to you. So that's why those sculptures are called Statistic 1 and Statistic 2. But it's me sort of removing my own ego from it and just actually offering myself to cut their names in bronze, not really an artistic statement as much as just an offering to them. Yeah.
Well, and when you think, you know, in Ireland, all of the different 136 workhouse sites in Ireland, if not more. Like in my hometown, there's one. We think there's about 4,000 people buried there, and we know the names of 3 people. Like not full names, either a first name or a last name. And funnily enough, Rowan, we know their talent. So there was Murren the dancer, Paddy the gosh or the jockey, and Buckley the fiddler. And that's all we know of who was buried in the hometown, you know. And so it's like there's the silence about it that I think the art transforms even more than the historians have, you know, like all of these books and the oral histories. And I'm delighted we're doing it, you know, and I think as a country we are starting to grapple with it. Would you think there had been no commemoration in Ireland until your peace in Dublin in 1998? Like that is kind of shocking, you know. Loretta says, please say hi to you from Loretta Leary in Connecticut. There is a small marker at the Staten Island.
Hi.
She says, myself and Lynn Rogers go to Staten Island every International Famine Commemoration Day, which is the 3rd Sunday in May. Oh, I think you were on Loretta last week too. So last week, Rowan, we had a historian. She's from Ireland, but she's teaching now in Glasgow, and she talked about epigenetics. And so, you know, when you said at the start about like, is the shame transmitted down from the survivor side or any, you know, we're not saying that all survivors did something nefarious to survive, but just the fact that you survived was enough. You know, she was talking about the despair kind of, and, you know, a higher instance of schizophrenia and depression and alcoholism and all these things that maybe it is transferred, you know, which is kind of terrifying to think that we have that legacy for at least maybe 3 generations, you know.
I think
so
people are.
Go ahead, sorry.
People are starting to look at that. People are starting to think about that, I think, you know.
Yeah, it's very important. One of our viewers on Facebook just asked, do you have any recommendations about the women's experience in Australia? I know there was that novel, is it called High Noon or High Tide or Noontide? Actually, that might have been recalled, so forget me.
There's one called The Flight of the Wren.
Oh yes, The Flight of the Wren. Okay, good.
Yeah, it's I think it's quite good because it shows both sides. I mean, it shows the women who were transported really for no reason at all. They didn't do anything wrong, and then it shows the ones who really were tough and had deserved to be transported. So it's a good book. I mean, I know so many of the more historical ones, which can be a little dry to read because it's just the historian obviously can't put up any artistic license into it. The story of Emily, for example, it's a historian who got that, and she was very much, oh, we can't say that she was raped because we don't know it. We can't say she didn't steal because I can, when I'm doing it, I can use a little bit more license to. So I think The Flight of the Wren is a good book about.
Okay. And I know there's one or two like scholarly books. I think one of them is called the Earl Grey Scheme or something like. Now that might be more, Siobhan, to do with the women who were leaving during the Great Hunger to Australia proper. You know, I'll ask you for some of these historical books, and I might type up, you know, tomorrow.
There's probably the most famous book is called The Floating Brothel.
Ooh.
Okay, because right at the beginning of the transportation, there was a ship. It normally took 3 to 4 months for them to get there, which is amazingly fast. I mean,
the other side of the world.
But there was one ship which took something like 9 months, because it turned out that it was before they had any control on what the sailors were doing with the. And of course, a lot of the women would have been, you know, prostitution was perfectly legal, and many women went into it in London. It was actually a better future for them than servitude, because they'd probably be raped anyway.
I'm just typing these up. What did you say the Wren book was called?
The Flight of the Wren, I think it's called.
Okay. Now, Loretta says, in terms of the Quakers, which is actually correct, you know, how much work they did for Ireland during the Great Hunger and supplying the soup kitchens and stuff. Was your dad, she said, interested in any of that history? And she agrees with you about the Flying Brothel being a great read. Was your father into that part of the history, you know, how much the Quakers did for Dublin?
He didn't talk about the famine. You know, it was a matter of shame. I think it's a bit that his desire to get out of Ireland, that's everything he wanted to do in his life. While my mother, daughter of an Irish revolutionary, all she wanted to do was get back to Ireland. And so there were big issues between them, and within the family, all of the talk was about my mother's father, who, you know, had been sort of active in a Supreme Court judge when in the Free State, and was sort of part of the drafting of the Proclamation of Independence and so on. I mean, he was right in there with the whole thing. And nobody ever spoke about my father's father. It was well after he died, when I was going out for Bloomsday with a cane that I use every Bloomsday. I dress up in a Joyce outfit. And I looked at the silver top on the cane, and it said Royal Irish Constabulary on it. And I suddenly put 2 and 2 together. And started Googling, as you can do. And sure enough, my father's father was in the Royal Irish Constabulary. And that isn't something you really talk about now because of the way history turned out. But he was probably doing, you know, it was a job.
Absolutely.
And until, with my parents not speaking about that, I should say they never mentioned my sister's name again after she took her life. All the photographs were removed. She didn't exist.
God.
That was the way they handled things in those days.
Yeah.
So the fact that my father's father had been on the wrong side of history meant that he just wasn't spoken about.
Yeah.
But actually, and that I think plays into why he didn't, he was ashamed of so much within his Irish heritage.
Well, and especially I suppose to be married to, as you say, the daughter of a revolutionary. Rowan, do you mind me asking, do you think it was because of grief for your sister that didn't speak her name, or because she had taken her life? Was that a big hurdle for them religiously, or maybe they weren't?
No, I don't. I don't. They never. They
didn't talk.
I knew she'd taken her life, but they never said. They didn't say anything.
Okay.
About it. It was after my father died that that was the first time I knew it for sure, because I saw the death certificate.
Yeah.
He put it away, but it destroyed him. Yeah, I mean, so that played into a lot of, but it's the messiness of Irish history altogether. I mean, the Dunleary Harbour thing, in much more recent times, how many women left that harbour in order to give birth in England, have an abortion in England, hand a child up to adoption in England, and came back like nothing had happened. And the family would never mention it. There's a lot we have to
deal
admit
with.
to.
Did you read Fintan O'Toole yesterday? Said exactly what we're talking about. He wrote a piece in the Irish Times about the weird dichotomy that Irish people can have in their heads at the same time. So, like, we want to preserve the Irish language. It's one of the things that's stopping us from uniting in one way, because we would refuse to give it up, and yet 8% speak it daily. So, like, what is the disconnect between a language that we don't use but we're allowing that? And I mean, I actually like the language. I think we should keep it, of course, but that carries through for everything. Is that we have this kind of apostasy about certain things, and yet we had mother and baby homes up and down the country. There's just this weird schizophrenia kind of in an Irish society, that we put up with all the time. The corruption, from Charlie Haughey, the rest of us are cutting back. It's all this, that we know it, but we don't talk about it all the time,
But I think if you take how backwards we were, shall we say 20 years ago, and how far we've come since, maybe we are ready for
those harder questions.
I was thinking, when you said about the women in Australia, there was a little thing which went through my mind then, that Australia was the first place to give women the vote.
Yeah.
And it was those those women were strong women. They were the ones who pushed through that vote for women. So, and I think we're changing so quickly here that
we are,
we're ready for those conversations now.
I hope so. And in terms of your own art, and I won't keep it much longer because I know it's very late at home, are you still, like, would there be another famine piece that you would take on, or do you think you've done enough with the Great Hunger? Obviously you've done other work too, but is this a subject that you think you've mined, or will there always be something?
It will always, I mean, I suppose at this stage in my career, I know that if I ever get remembered, it's going to be for the work I've done around the Great Hunger. It's going to be that migration thing. So I suppose I'm always aware of the gaps in the whole story, like the fact that that all of the sculptures going to the US and Canada. I was asked if I'd do a sculpture of Darcy McGee for Canada. And I said, no, the world does not need another statue of a man. We got to, and that's where Ellen Cashman came in. So, I'm very aware of the gaps in my career, and those are the ones I'd be trying to fill.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Loretta said she's rooting for Staten Island still, but I spoke with a group. I probably shouldn't name them, but a year or two ago, it was in the middle of COVID actually. So he came down to the museum, but we were closed, and he gave a talk about a disaster that happened to an Irish immigrant community here in the States, and they had commissioned a sculptor. I don't think it's you. I think it's a local guy, you know, in the state. But anyway, long story short, your man did up a draft of what he was going to sculpt. It would be a man with a pick and, you know, very typical kind of miner. Turns out most of the people who died in the mine accidents were women and children. And they're too far into the process to change. And I was like, I don't care if the thing was actually half cast, you know, you have to change that. The monument to that story cannot be a man with a pickaxe. Like, it has to be, but I don't think they can change it. Yeah, wow. So Loretta, you know, so I find that heartbreaking, you know.
I think that's where you know, when taking on a job, I will research a person very, very carefully before I say yes, because you actually have to check out those things. There was another thing for Canada recently where I looked into it and then I found out some stuff and I just said no.
Yeah, you didn't want to memorialize.
This is not going to stand the test of time. This is not.
Yeah.
This is not a person we should be commemorating.
Yeah. Well, it's great to see that, you know, this, you know, I think we are expanding who we should memorialize, how we should do it, and, you know, if artists are also questioning, you know, why or should I think that's a really good movement forward, you know, because we do tend to default, I think, to great white men, and so, or even anonymous white men in the case of this miner, but, you know, it doesn't tell the story of what happened there. It's kind of tragic. So I have to tell you, Rowan, people are delighted. They're commenting here live on Facebook too. Thank you so much. As I say, I think this absolutely rounded out the series. You know, we some very sad, hard stories with this Black 47 commemoration, but, you know, little pockets of light where we had Cian McMahon talk about the journey over, and, you know, sometimes the ships were not as terrible, or you know, the hope, as I say, that sometimes immigration gave you. And Tyler Ambender did the same, kind of debunked a little bit of the misery. You know, his findings seem to suggest that if they had someone to come to, or if there was enough of them to create a little community like that entire estate in Kerry, you know, that came out, they did much better in America than ones that came, you know, kind of singly or by themselves. And so does that network, you know, but the 7-year statistic, you know, still is there. So I really appreciate you talking tonight. And again, you know, this was so much more than I thought it would be. Your process is amazing. When you showed the picture, I said, doesn't this look very calm? All I was thinking of, no, the heat of that. And I didn't even think about the weight, but the heat is not making me calm, you know. And so Loretta says she joined a little bit late, but it will be on our YouTube channel and our website, so you can catch up from the start. I must ask you, I presume you've often splattered yourself with boiling hot bronze and all. Like, do you have any horrific injuries, or are you always super careful?
No, I've had a few knocks and scrapes and burns, but actually the worst injury I had was when I was working with fiberglass, not bronze at all. And I caught fire with fiberglass and finished up in intensive care. So it's strange. I think with the bronze, you're dealing with something which is so dangerous.
Yeah.
So incredibly dangerous that you're taking care. Yeah. And then as a sort of foundry man, when I'm working with something like fiberglass,
you think it's a doddle. Yeah. So, well, and I thought that link between your childhood and Cyprus, you know, who knew that this is where you got the love of bronze? And I meant to ask you too, does it weather okay? It must do, bronze. Like, does it get the green, or it'll be fine?
Yes, it will to some extent, but when you do the completely raw casting, the way I do it, there's a kind of shell which comes from the heat of the casting and the mold, which is so incredibly resilient that it would take a long time for anything to change on. But
even
bronze
in Irish weather.
Bronze will last 2,000 years, no problem.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and it's a kind of malleable metal, I presume.
But actually, one little crouching famine figure, which was in a collection in California, in a house which burnt down in the fires there recently. Every single thing was lost in the house, with quite I think an 84-year-old man or something and his much younger wife. They lost absolutely everything except this one bronze sculpture, which survived perfectly.
Well,
So,
we'll see.
I mean, that is what bronze can take. It
Yeah.
doesn't mind the house fire or anything.
Yeah, well, you make them well, obviously. So I thank you so much. We'll definitely have you back, I think, to talk at some point. And if you're ever in Albany, we'd love to have you visit the museum. We're hoping, as I say, to get, now that the Fairfield Great Hunger Museum have set themselves up, that we'll be able to visit that, or they'll be able to give us the touring collection again, which we had it in 2020. Loretta's saying thank you so much and sending you hugs. And thank you for the coffee, she said, in Dublin. Siobhan said, even if we didn't do well in America, we survived. That's exactly right. So thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Rowan. This was absolutely amazing. And as I say, I think it was the perfect ending to what has been a fantastic series, but this was getting to the heart, I think, of the human side of the story that we wanted to tell. So thank you very, very much, and for sharing your own
Thank you
story.
very much. It's been a pleasure.
And,
Thank you.
have a happy holiday. If I probably won't be talking to you before Christmas, but everyone enjoy. This is our last event of the year, actually. I just forgot. So thank you all for joining, and we'll see everyone in January. Thank you. Take care. Good night, Rowan.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.